Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Lab 207 Webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and I'll be hanging out with you today as we continue on in our series about Earth systems. Topic for the day is going to be smart growth. So, as always, let me get you some objectives, and we'll get going. Two things that I need you to know or be able to do by the end of the day. And the first is to understand the need for smart growth, and the second is to discuss each of the 10 characteristics of smart growth. So, that being said, let's just go ahead and jump in and get going. First thing I want to talk about is smart growth itself, and what is it? Smart growth is essentially the anti-sprawl. In our last video, we talked about all of the characteristics of urban sprawl, and we talked about the things that cause urban sprawl. Today we're going to talk about this idea called smart growth, which is the idea that cities will grow and develop within themselves and provide housing options and business and recreation options within the city so that people are not pushed out into the surrounding land. And if you're from Portland, you're going to see lots of pictures from your city today because you guys are doing some things well. So let's go ahead and jump on in. The first and likely one of the most important characteristics of smart growth is mixed land use. In our previous video, we talked about how zoning laws sometimes can separate business from industry, from housing, from residential areas. So you've got this blocked up pattern where you don't have any mixing between the ways land is used. In smart growth, you break down all those walls and you set up mixed use zoning, which essentially says that you can have multiple things occurring in one area at one time. And what this looks like essentially is you might have a main street, and along that street you've got like a bottom floor of shops and restaurants and coffee shops and bars, and then above those places you have got housing options, whether apartments or condos or lofts. There might be some offices up there. Either way, what you're trying to do is you're trying to produce a situation where people have got everything that they need for daily life within their neighborhood, and they don't have to travel to another zone just to get the things they need. So that would be the first and likely one of the most important qualities of smart growth, because it facilitates everything else. Within smart growth, it's also really important to have diverse housing options. So in our urban sprawl video, I talked about the process of urban blight, where all the people with money move out of the city into the suburbs and they take their tax revenues with them, and so the services within the city decrease and start to go downhill, and the people who don't necessarily have the money to pay for those services have to suffer from decreased services. So in a smart growth scenario, you've got diverse housing options, and what that means is you've got big, rich, nice condos for those who have got money, and then more modest, affordable options for those who don't have as much. And the idea behind this is that if you've got the people with money living in the area, their tax dollars can fund the services that everybody should have access to. So a person who might not necessarily have as much money, their kids can still have access to good schools because the person living in the fancy condo on the 20th floor is putting more money into the system, supporting the schools in that area. Also, it's been shown to be socially beneficial for people of different classes and incomes to interact with one another. It develops a greater sense of community and empathy and a greater willingness to, work across lines that might normally divide one person from another. Walkable neighborhoods are also super critical for smart growth. A walkable neighborhood is obviously a neighborhood where people can walk, but there's some characteristics of a walkable neighborhood that make it, more pleasant for the pedestrian. Sidewalks should be good and wide for people to flow easily up and down. You should have slower traffic in the area so people aren't scared of getting run down by cars. Rather than setting up a situation where you've got a sidewalk, then a big parking lot, and then a store, stores are brought right up to the sidewalk so people can just kind of walk along the sidewalk and turn into the shop they need. They're not separated by a big old parking lot. Usually there's going to be green space, there are going to be trees to make it look nice. There will be on-street parking that kind of provides a buffer between the sidewalk and the traffic. So all of these characteristics go together into increasing foot traffic in an area, which is good for businesses. It's also good for the community because people interact with each other as they're walking up and down the sidewalk. Community and stakeholder interactions are one of the things that brings flavor to a neighborhood. So in a traditional urban sprawl setting, it's usually the land developers that have got the greatest say in how things go down. They say, all right, I'm going to put a housing development here, we're going to put a big box store over there, and then people kind of come to the area. So it's like the developers say this is the way it's going to be, and then people move into an area. In smart growth, you've got the community collaborating with the I guess, developers that are coming in to produce a neighborhood that people actually want to be in, one that makes sense for the area, one that people feel like they have ownership in, and usually a more unique area that represents the interests of everybody, not just those who are trying to make a buck. Compact building is another super important characteristic of smart design. So urban sprawl, we talked about giant lots sprawling all over the land, having huge footprints, taking up a bunch of space. In smart design, the goal is to build up rather than out, because the bottom of a building has got the same footprint on the land regardless of whether it's 1 story or 20 stories. So in an effort to have more people living in an area taking up less space, parking situations and buildings are built straight up rather than out across the land. And as we continue through our list that just keeps going and going and going, the next one we're going to come to is a sense of place. And if you've traveled at all, you might have an idea of a place like this. It's a neighborhood that you just walk into and you're like, oh wow, this neighborhood is unique. There's something different about it. It's got a distinct flavor. It's got a really cool character. It's a place that people want to be. It's a place that they are proud of. So in smart growth, you try to foster that sense of place, that unique character, so that people want to live in the neighborhood, so that people are proud of their neighborhoods and they're willing to take care of them and keep them clean and look out for them. So this is basically saying, rather than in the urban sprawl model where every subdivision looks the same and there's no real pride in your community or anything like that, it's saying, this is my neighborhood and this is what my neighborhood's like, this is why you should come visit my neighborhood, and this is why I'm going to take care of my neighborhood. Protection of land is also very important to the idea of smart growth because, well, I guess the whole principle is we're going to grow smart so that we're not using up the land. And even within city centers, it's really important to have green space for recreation, for protection of the environment. Also, in smart growth situations, you want to protect farmland. You want to leave land available for people to recreate on, whether it's biking or running or hiking or whatever. So if you're trying to develop in a smart way, you're going to protect green land and green space both within the city and around the outside of the city. And this is where, I don't know, I guess Portland kind of made a name for itself. It's not the biggest city when it comes to public transit, but I will tell you what, they have got a killer transit-oriented development scheme. And what that is basically saying you want to give people as many options as you can to take mass transit and to get around without using a car. I can tell you that my wife and I frequently travel to Portland. Once we get there, we can stay for a week or two and not need a car once, because they've got trolley systems, they've got light rail, you've got buses. It's a very well put together system. And in smart growth, you want to do everything you can to keep people from having to have individual cars. So you set up trolley systems and buses and trains, but you also have things like walkability and things nearby so people can walk from one place to another. And something that has been popping up over the last 5-ish years are the idea of car and bike shares, where you buy a membership to a service. There are banks of bikes or cars around that you can hop onto and access through your membership, go to where you're going, and drop the bike off. So it's a cool system where you don't necessarily have to own a bike or a car, but you can still benefit from the, I guess, freedom that comes with those things. Another important thing is developing existing communities. So rather than setting up a suburb that is going to be like this refuge away from the city, you want to develop within the city, and you want to focus on infill and possibly urban growth boundaries. Infill is basically the idea that you use up vacant lots within a city and you put new businesses and new life and new community in those areas that already exist, rather than building outside the city. And I've got my hometown Durham up right here as an example, because this is something that's been going on a lot in Durham in the last 5 or 8 years, where there were a bunch of vacant lots and abandoned factories and warehouses and stuff. It's all being converted into land and apartments and urban farms and businesses and shops. So the idea is that you use the resources that you already have available to you rather than spreading out and building all over the place. And you focus on developing a sense of place within that community rather than looking elsewhere. Here's the last thing I want to focus on is predictable development processes. There's a reason that suburbs all look the same, and that's pretty much because there's one streamlined process for getting building approved. So builders just keep going through that process over and over again, and it's easy and it's predictable and it's fast. In a smart growth idea or in a smart growth scheme, basically what city officials would want to do is set up a process for zoning and for permit approval that encourages diversity and interesting uses of land rather than just one homogeneous, land development. And it also needs to be set up such that the processes encourage the builders to develop within the city limits and focus on that infill that I just talked about, rather than looking outside of the city where things are easy and the land is open. So that's what we've got as far as characteristics go. Just a couple of benefits I want to talk about. If you go with this smart growth concept, there's a couple things. You get a significant reduction in water pollution. The reason for this is that water runs off of concrete as it runs along concrete. So rainstorm, boom, the streets get washed. Everything that gets washed off the street, oil, gas, tar, whatever, that ends up in the stormwater system. So if you build smart, then you leave all that land outside of the city open. It's not covered in concrete, so the water can just soak down into the land without having to run across a bunch of streets. So the more concrete use that you can reduce, the better. You are also reducing the amount of impervious surface, which is basically surface that water cannot soak down through. It's also been shown that using infill principles in an area can reduce driving by the citizens in that area by up to 58%. So using these smart growth characteristics can significantly reduce the amount of miles that people drive, which obviously reduces the amount of carbon dioxide that they emit, and oil and gas that is used. So that's it. That is smart growth. Make sure that you understand why smart growth is important. Make sure you understand the characteristics of smart growth. Thanks for joining us on the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite. We'll see you again.